Thank you for joining us in person and online today at this exciting webinar. On behalf of the Brisbane Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Professional Alliance, BATSIPA, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you wherever you are today. We will be talking about reconciliation. More than a word, reconciliation takes action. I will be your host and MC. My name is Toni Janke. I'm a Wuddathi and Miriam woman from North Queensland, living and working on Yuggera land here in Brisbane. I'm the Manager of Culture and Inclusion with Centacare Family and Relationship Services in Brisbane. Centacare is a proud member of BATSIPA. Other members are Anglicare, Relationships Australia, Churches of Christ, Work Up Queensland, the Brisbane City Council, and various other non-government, government and community organisations and agencies. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We encourage you to revisit the content and share it with colleagues. I'd actually now like to hand over briefly to Kevin Yayi from QUT, Queensland University of Technology. He's going to just do a brief welcome to QUT. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Hi folks, my name is Kevin Yayi and I'm a proud Waka Waka and South Sea Islander man. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, custodians and caretakers of the land on which we meet, the stolen lands of the Yuggera and Turrbal people. A conversation about reconciliation can't happen without first foregrounding Indigenous sovereignty and what that means for Indigenous people, First Nations people of this continent now known as Australia. More than a word, reconciliation takes action is the theme for this year's Reconciliation Week. And I hope that we're able to have some real but tough conversations about what that might mean for different folk in the room. QUT doesn't have any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander flags on our campuses, but I am told that they do take reconciliation seriously. So maybe that's something that we can work towards also. Folks, thank you, and I hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. And I too acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we gather today. Say at the outset, though, that it is a really great honour to be here today with this stellar panel who've responded so enthusiastically to our invitation to speak with us about reconciliation, what works, what are some of the challenges, and how we can all embrace the work of reconciliation. On our panel today, we have Dr. Stephen Hagan, author and anti-racism campaigner, who joins us online from Darwin in the Northern Territory. Welcome, Stephen. Great to have you.
Thank you, Toni.
Thank you, Stephen. I also welcome Auntie McDougall, respected Torres Strait Islander elder from Relationships Australia, Queensland, and Queensland's Senior Australian of the Year. Welcome, Auntie Rose. Always lovely to see you. Thank you. We're also delighted to welcome Judge Josephine Willis, AM, of the Federal Circuit Court of Australia. Welcome, Judge Willis. Wonderful to see her again. And we also welcome Commissioner Scott McDougall. McDougall? I was getting that wrong. Oh, goodness, sorry. Queensland Human Rights Commissioner. Welcome, Scott. From QUT, the Faculty of Health, of course, you've already been introduced to Kevin Yayi, who also joins the panel as a speaker. And last but not least, we welcome Karen Mundine, CEO of Reconciliation Australia, who's travelled from Canberra to be with us today as part of this event. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule this week. So please make all of our panellists welcome. Give them a round of applause. I'd now like to actually begin the formal part of our panel today. As has been said, we're celebrating National Reconciliation Week, which runs from the 27th of May to the 3rd of June each year. We've already spoken this year's theme, More Than a Word, Reconciliation Takes Action. And you'll be hearing from our panellists today. Many of you know that reconciliation has and continues to be an important journey for all of us as individuals, as organisations and our nation as a whole. It's about building relationships through respect, justice, truth commitment and, of course, action. We will be hearing from our key speakers on the panel today, but also opening up to a Q&A, a question and answer session at the end of today's webinar about reconciliation. You can write your questions and submit them in person today for those who are here in person, or via the chat box online, and we'll be running that session after we've heard from all our speakers. So if you have questions, please put them forward. So to start our panel discussion this afternoon, I'd like to invite again academic, author and anti-racism campaigner Dr. Stephen Hagan. For those who don't know, Stephen is the editor of National Indigenous Times. He's a university lecturer, documentary filmmaker and former diplomat. In recent times, he's called out racism, leading a successful campaign to change the name of Australian cheese manufacturer Coon Cheese. He's also challenged recently Carlton Football Club, requesting that racial connotations be removed from the club's song. He's received many awards for his work in support of reconciliation and building bridges. He's widely published in various fields today. Good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Toni.
Welcome. It's been a busy week of raising awareness about reconciliation and several important issues that we face as a nation. Through your work, you've challenged many systemic issues that have really, I think, forced us as a society to think more deeply about these issues and some of the structural and systemic issues that exist today in our society. Reconciliation is much more than a word. It does require action. So, Steve, why do you think reconciliation is important, and how can we work together to ensure that reconciliation is more than a word? And how can we challenge the stereotypes and break down and eliminate the structural and systemic racism in our communities?
Thank you, Toni. Look, before I answer those questions, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which your people are meeting there today, the eminent panel who's meeting on the Yagara land. Also, the lands of all the traditional owners who are tuning into this webinar. I'm a Cullery man from southwest Queensland, out near Thargomindah, for those who may not know where Cullery is. That's on my father's side. Also, my father's mother, she's a Mundine lady. On my mother's side, I'm a Cooma man from around the St George Bollen area. And on my mother's side, I'm a Gongari man from the Mitchell area. So I have a lot of different family traditional links around southwest Queensland. And the theme of today is the reconciliation. It's not just a word, it's more than a word. You've got to understand that in order to reconcile, we've got to look at what it is we're trying to reconcile. If you look at the broader sense of the word reconciliation, it is an action of bringing together or bringing an action of getting people's views to a compatible stage where both of them share respect and mutually agree on things. I think for far too long, the onus of reconciliation has been on First Nations people. We've always been asked to reconcile with non-Indigenous Australians. Now, I think you've got to really look at the history until you understand and until the broader Australian community can appreciate the history of colonisation. They will be forever denying that there has been past atrocities that they need to address. The most classic case of reconciliation, as far as I'm concerned, is there's the Mabo decision of '92 and the legislation of '93. Now, up until then, Australians, I'm talking about all parties of all different political persuasions, believed that Australia was terra nullius. That means empty land. So when those 11 ships sailed across here in 1788 and landed in the land of the Aurora people in Sydney Cove, they saw Aboriginal people. They saw campfires. And the beauty and the good thing for us nowadays as Indigenous scholars or eminent Indigenous people around the country is that the very, very good thing about all this is the Europeans or non-Indigenous people, they had a propensity to write down everything. So while the deniers say things didn't happen and there was terra nullius. They were busy little bodies in those big ships or in their little huts, writing down what they were seeing Aboriginal people. And even the written work confirms a lot of things that we already know we were doing. I mean, we weren't nomads roaming around the country. Certainly there were people, our mob, in areas where there wasn't much water or food. They did move around. They were nomadic, and they had to be nomadic to survive, to sustain a lifestyle. But you take people in Gudjutmara, people down in Victoria. I mean, they had a very well-established community. There's rock formations that show clusters of housing. They also had a very sophisticated network of irrigation, of watering, of aquaculture, the most advanced in the world. And you can go anywhere in Australia to find evidence of our wonderful sophistication. Our people were very, very sophisticated. You don't survive in the harshest land in the world for over 100,000 years if you didn't have the smarts about you and sustain a lifestyle. But not only that, our people were so sophisticated, they organised themselves in sovereign nations of 250, 300 different tribes throughout the length and breadth of the country. Sure, there were some tribes who wanted to expand their boundaries, go for lands that were more plentiful in food and water, but that's conflict. There's conflict everywhere. But in the main, Aboriginal people stuck within their sovereign territories and had respect. Obviously, the word reconciliation would have come into play with people in their sovereign lands. They would have had to reconcile differences. And then you're looking across a lot of things. What I've done recently, I'm writing a book for children at the moment, which looks at the successes of Aboriginal life. For instance, how many kids would know today that Aboriginal people really introduced the superglue? The spinifex resin was heated and molded into a thick paste that could glue anything. It was immovable. The spearheads, anything at all they wanted to glue together was made from the spinifex resin in Central Australia. And then as I talked about the aquaculture in Victoria, and I'm sure it's right throughout Australia, the boomerang, there's a lot of things that's involved, the cosmology. I mean, everything, you can read about all these things. And I think this is what is needed for white Australia to understand and appreciate the sophistication of our race of people. I've been involved, as Toni, as you introduced me, I mean, I've been involved in fighting social justice campaigns for a long time. You take the recent success I've had with coon cheese. I started that 21 years ago. So it took me 21 years of fighting to change what I deemed a racist word, a slur that's used against Aboriginal people. It's a slur that they use. It's similar to the N-word and abo and bung that's used at footy matches and nightclubs most nights of the week, that causes conflict, verbal and physical. So I'm a new kid on the block in terms of the reconciliation process. In terms of fighting for social justice. When I was a kid growing up in Cunnamulla, I wasn't raised in a standard 3-bedroom house. I was raised on a fringe camp. Now, Aboriginal people were moved off their traditional lands. In my case, it was Culley land, and we were moved, and that was principally because of pastoral expansion. They wanted the land, so they just moved Aboriginal people off to missions and reserves. Cherbourg, or up to Warrabinda, or up to Palm Island. Transport, off you go, you're going out to Cunnamulla. And as with most cases of people who were moved to the fringes of society, you're either placed on 2 locations. And the 2 locations are the most undesirable parcels of land any.
I'm just noticing, Steve, we're having a bit of trouble here with the reception. You seem to be cutting in and out. We've just got a couple of minutes Sorry, Steve, we're just noticing here with a bit of a sensitive technical issue with the internet cutting in and out. Just got a couple of minutes, if that's okay with you, and then we'll head back to the panel. Can you hear us? And you're just on mute. Don't you love technology?
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Minutes. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. So yeah, look, I know it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but and when I was a kid growing up in Cunnamulla, and I give you the historical perspective because unless people understand where we're coming from, Aboriginal people and the strong advocates like myself, you don't know. I mean, you just don't know what it is we're trying to reconcile. And in Cunnamulla, Aboriginal people lived in the French camp, and we lived near the sewage treatment works. I'll give you one example, and it'll probably be enough to explain my lived memory of marginalisation and disadvantage. We never had any taps for over 300 displaced people living on the fringe of a small rural town. Yet the cemetery that divided us from the township had 3 taps. And on Sundays, the local non-Indigenous people would go into the cemetery and fill their vases full of water and put flowers in it and take it to the plots of the graves of the dearly departed. They even had security there sleeping at the cemetery, so Aboriginal people couldn't go in and steal the water. Every Saturday, the women knew the routine of the husband and wife who managed the place at the cemetery there, and they would roll 44-gallon drums up to the fence to fill up the hook or hose to the big 44-gallon drum, fill them up and roll them back home for basic household consumptions. Now, that is what someone my age, I'm 61 years of age, I remember that clearly. So when we talk about reconciliation, we do want to sit in and understand why white Australia is having difficulty acknowledging the past and the governments who administered policies from the past. And I referred to before about terra nullius. Labor and Liberal were all going on with this notion that there was terra nullius. And I see we've got an eminent judge there as well. You know, judges, everybody was going along saying this land was terra nullius, when they knew very well that this land was occupied by First Nations people. So, okay, we got Mabo underway and we got legislation in '93, but you got the Adam Goodses of the world fighting against a little 13-year-old kid who's called him an ape from the sideline at a game against Collingwood when he played for Sydney Swans. You've got Latrell Mitchell now for the NRL who's speaking out against racism. And all the good people who are standing up fighting against racism, they're being vilified. They're being attacked. They're being attacked in Facebook. I mean, I've had plenty of instances of being attacked. You know, it's like a daily occurrence. You wake up and you're looked at in a wrong way because of the colour of your skin. I understand that some people who may have fair or olive complexion may not have the same experience as people who are more Aboriginal in appearance or darker complexion. But it just goes to show what white Australia accepts as being okay. And even with the sport, getting back to sport, because everyone's a sporting fanatic, or most people are, the ones who are really admired and respected, and it's not an insult to them, are the ones who didn't really speak up. And they remained quiet because they knew how sensitive white Australia was to people who challenged the status quo. If you challenge the status quo about anything, you're likely to get your contract torn up, or you're likely to get rough play from the opposition. So what can we do now? What can we do to address reconciliation? Well, I think white Australia really has to make an effort to read up about it, watch documentaries, a lot of wonderful documentaries, a lot of wonderful films. They need to make an effort to contact local Aboriginal communities, land councils, or they need to be sensible about how they approach Aboriginal people. Just because they're going up and talking to an Aboriginal person who looks like an elder, that doesn't mean they're going to have a good, pleasant experience from that person. They could have an awful experience from some of our people who are very angry. So it's about being able to recognise or seeking advice and guidance from respected Aboriginal people about where they should go in that community, who they should see. Learn about what traditional owner group owns the land in where they were born, where they were raised. Get to know some famous Aboriginal people, David and Ivan, right through to all the famous people. There's so many to name. So Toni, that's sort of the stuff that I wanted to say in the outset about reconciliation.
I know, Steve, thank you. You've shared so much history there, and I really appreciate your honesty and, you know, you raising some of those very important questions I think that we do need to ask ourselves as a nation, as a community. You know, I thank you for sharing your personal story and for the wonderful work you do. And Steve, of course, will be available on the panel to ask questions later on. But I'd now like to direct our next question to Auntie McRose-Elu. As I said, Auntie Rose was recently awarded the 2021 Queensland Senior Australian of the Year. She's advocated tirelessly for Torres Strait Islander rights and social justice all her life. She is a passionate but gentle leader who works with Relationships Australia Queensland, and she's a member of the Brisbane Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Professional Alliance. Welcome again, Auntie Rose. Auntie Rose, your question, as a Torres Strait Islander elder, how is reconciliation working to build awareness of issues for the Torres Strait Islander community, and what are some of the challenges that Torres Strait Islander communities face in terms of achieving reconciliation today?
First of all, I would just like to acknowledge my sister, all of you families here. I can call you all extended families. Torres Strait Islander on Aboriginal land. Mina bigeso, Sisi, for your welcome. All of you, it's always a sentimental part of journey. When it comes to this part of the month every year, it's very emotional, mixed emotions. All of our people, people of the nation, First Nation people of the Torres Strait. Thank you for welcoming me to your land, sister. May I just say something in my language, in the way of blessing for our presence here with us as unity in one, to try to come to the fore to understand where we're at and what journey will we take from today for the next reconciliation week. Napalak muragaru damizina ina ngizubara dalawa. Nangita plak mayudis kedang alpalak murpemin. Murayananab. Ulay gapa. Mani sinabing ulay. Kumabay gapa nabi kagatra mabay gapa. Lakmur payayman. Mab kalmeladun. Getanunidis. Aweso kimeso. Where you come from? You were bed go sleeper. When you kai kai? Uda you? Uda be make you come here? How you come here? Terminologies, expressions of people through the years. Ask questions. Where do you come from? What sort of food do you eat? Where do you sleep? How do you sleep? Difficult questions. And yet at the same time, those questions raised a lot of questions within our hearts as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But you know what? We are strong. We are unique. We are the people of this planet. We are the first people of the planet. The God has put you, me, everyone, on each and every boundaries of this land and of the shores and the seas of the Torres Strait, from Murray to Boigu, including my area, Northern Peninsula area. Who are you to judge? What is so difficult? To come and sit down and listen to one another, understand. Hey, you plasabe, isa no langus lomi, I shouldn't be talking this language here because I speak actually 9 dialects. That would be really good if we all speak in those dialects, our own languages. But still, we are honored because we want to stand. We want to fight that race. We want to race and win the race. Isn't it beautiful in a way? How big is the field? We talk about the football team, the football areas where our boys gracefully play football to win. Torres Strait Islanders, from the history began, has been amalgamated to a beautiful nation, Australia. So therefore, we were just one native people of this land. There was no clarification of saying Aboriginal Australia, Torres Strait Melanesia. Different cultures, different traditions, different ways, but together, unity with the love of God, all of us as one. The history goes like this. So therefore, the history then says, you play all the same. You play everyone same. You play all the same. Why is it so difficult in a way to say, Auntie Rose, Auntie Carrie, Auntie Deborah, Auntie Toni, or brothers here and uncle, come, you may sit down. You may go yarn. We're going to have a chat. Let's get to know one another proper. Not like that. You come and sit and look very serious. I'm beginning to wonder sometimes, when I look at the people in the front, I'm a public speaker, as everyone knows. I'd like to see to the head of people, inside the head. I'm thinking, am I wasting my time again to go over and over and over again? Or is it a game? How much are you taking in or listening? How much are you taking on board and understanding? And then I'm going to ask a question like this. Where are you now from 2020 in this 2021 space? Where are we now? How far are we now? Are we mark time one time? Are we progressing? Are we listening? Or is it just a waste of time? But guess what? It's not a waste of time for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They are the winners. We are the winners. Auntie Rose's intellectual thinking, my intellectual thinking, is about God's love with all of us together in this universe. He put us there for the purpose to own, to give us something that we own. The land, the water, the sea, the ocean, the stars, the skies, the wind, the current, the depth of the ocean, the food, the language, cultures of different parts of this beautiful country, and very small Torres Strait Islanders. It's a learning thing in a way to be able to say, I want you to know me a little bit more better. I struggle with the thing every year when I go and do the public speaking as a Torres Strait Islander. But I don't want to say, I'm sick and tired of telling you that thing over and over again, because it's just not in my system. What I say is, I come from the chieftain clan. I am the winner. You are the loser. So if you want to be the winner, come with me and be part of this race. Those things I see as an elder, as a Torres Strait Islander elder, I want to see in a way for all of us, good people together, to listen to one another and get to know one another. Listen carefully and understand the Torres Strait Islander ways, the languages, the responses, the interpretations, the customs, the traditions, that of the people of the nation. It's a long journey, my father once put it. You look at the bridge, and he said to me, there's a long bridge, and in that long bridge, there is those bolts. And those bolts can never fit on them holes, may not fit. And it's a long bridge and it's still yet to build and to be finished. So therefore, I think, to conclude this, because you're putting up that thing for 1 minute, because I'm gonna go over the 1 minute in a ways like this. Sit and listen seriously, deeply, your hand up ahead, and get to know one another. Ask questions. No more divisions. No more of those holes on the road. Let's that be a bitumen all the way. Let's not there be ripples in the Torres Strait waters, so the boat can just sail freely from Cape York to my island in the top Western Torres Strait. Listen to one another, get to know one another, the inner part of our traditions and our cultures, and understanding. The phrases, the responses, sometimes it's always difficult. You say something and the answer that you get is not the one that you're asking for. So I think it's a way to all of us to come together in unity with God's love. We need to be together and learn from one another and do not be judgmental ourselves.
Thank you so much, Auntie Rose, for that beautiful, beautiful speech. And, you know, you are our elder, but now we share you with the rest of Queensland. Such wisdom, and thank you so much for your gentle and passionate words today. Our next question is directed to Kevin Yaoyi of QUT. Kevin is a Waka Waka and South Sea Islander man who grew up on BATSIPA country and has lived on Yagara land in Megan, in Brisbane, for the past 16 years. Kevin is a qualified social worker who's worked in child safety and youth justice. He recently managed Brisbane's bail and order support program and is now based at QUT. In addition to teaching a variety of Indigenous study units, he's also, in his spare time, a full-time research student currently looking at ways to better support First Nations peoples experiencing racism. Thank you for joining us, Kevin. As you know, Kevin, we're still seeing movements today like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the Black Lives Matter campaign, Black Deaths in Custody, Stolen Generations and Trauma Survivors, the Family Matters campaign. Many of our children are still being removed from families and placed in institutionalised care at appalling rates. We are still seeing high rates of domestic and family violence amongst our people in families and communities, those who struggle with substance abuse and addiction, mental health, unemployment, homelessness, incarceration, suicide, and so on. Why do you think it's so difficult today, apart from what you've heard others speak about, why do you think it's so difficult to see the changes that many of our communities are still fighting for? And how can organisations and institutions really promote reconciliation and healing for our people?
Thank you, Toni, for that introduction. Hi, folks, again. I'd first like to begin by thanking you, Auntie Carey, for that welcome to country and for reminding us the importance of place. Conversation during reconciliation can't happen without the importance of talking about place and our sovereignty and our own sovereign unique rights as well. So thank you very much for that welcome to country. Why do you think it is still so difficult today to see the changes that many of our communities are still fighting for? And how can organisations and institutions help promote reconciliation? Folks, before I answer that question, I'd like to introduce myself as a proud Waka Waka and South Sea Islander man. I've been living down here in Mundine for the last 16 years. I don't know how long you have to live in Mundine before you can be considered a Brisbane black fella, but I do consider myself Brisbane blacks as well. Folks, Australia remains the only country under the Commonwealth without a treaty. Since 1991, some 30 years ago, since the handing down of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report, there's been 430 plus deaths in custody. As far as I'm concerned, that tells you everything you need to know about reconciliation in this place. Aboriginal journalist Amy Maguire will tell you that where else will you see 430 deaths in custody and 0 convictions? How's that work? Folks, I believe you can't be in Reconciliation Week without talking about racism, about settler colonialism, the impacts of racism, and the strategies that are underpinned of these. My father goes under a different surname, Brown, and he tells a story about how our grandfather was actually removed from his country up north and brought down to Cherbourg. And my dad tells a story about the social workers who removed my grandfather and his brothers and said, you know, you're beautiful brown boys. And that's how the name stuck. What we know for sure is that our communities are wanting better outcomes for our people. We know this. A large problem when we talk about health disparities or the disparities in the justice system or the education system is that somehow we're not deserving of those things. You know, when we think about our families who at the coroner's inquest that look into the deaths of our mob in custody, you know, we'd look at the death of, you know, the recent Auntie Tanya Day a couple of years ago, an Aboriginal woman who was locked up for public drunkenness, and on that very same night, a non-Indigenous woman was taken home safely, and she was in a similar circumstance. I believe our communities have the answers for these. I just don't believe that white folk are listening. Yeah. We know as First Nations people in this country, a thing or two about survival. We've been doing it for 60, 70, 80,000 years. Perhaps we know the answers. I'd argue that we do and we always have. When we think about the impacts of colonisation and colonialism, one of the major things that I've experienced as a social worker working out in rural and remote settings like Roma, Mitchell, out in Yanadangi country, I am aware that non-Indigenous people don't like to talk about this stuff. Hey, never. And then when the conversations are brought up, it's quite often flipped on us. And then we're having to then argue and fight just to let people know that we're deserving of these things that non-Indigenous people experience on the daily. Aboriginal activist and local Indigenous woman, a member of Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance, Ruby Waterton, will tell you, no colonised people in the world have ever accomplished anything by appeasing or appealing to the morality of our oppressors. I mean, we talk about reconciliation, but we don't have a treaty. We talk about reconciliation, and up until recently, if we want to keep things local, we talk about reconciliation. Up until recently, there was only 2 states and territories that had a Human Rights Act, Victoria and ACT. Queensland's only just got theirs. Yeah, finally, yeah. I mean, and it's great that the Human Rights Commission exists, but as someone who's run that gauntlet, I often wonder how blackfellas are meant to run that gauntlet, because it's not an easy run. How can organisations and institutions help promote reconciliation? I'm a full-time research student here at QUT, looking at best ways to support First Nations people experiencing racism, especially for those people who have chosen to go through some type of complaint process. When I think about my studies here as an undergraduate social work student, in 4 years, we only had one mandatory Indigenous unit. Like 4 years of a social work degree, and folks are only required to attend one mandatory unit. I'm telling you, social workers, when they leave this institution and they find work since child safety or youth justice, have an incredible amount of statutory power. It's social workers that remove our children from our families, from kin and country. It's social workers who are breaching our young people when they don't meet their youth justice orders and bail conditions. But it's social workers who only need to attend one unit. So in terms of this question, how can organisations and institutions help promote reconciliation? Well, if we're going to keep things local, how about some universities start to make these units mandatory? And not just for social workers, because tell me a space where blackfellas don't use. We have eyes, we go to optometrists. We have teeth and we go to dentists. But I don't see them got mandatory classes. I get invited to guest lectures for one class here and there. And then me and my mob have to then front up at the optometrist or at the legal centre or at child safety or at the dentist. And all they know about me and my mob are what they see on Channel 7, 9 and 10 News. And we know the role that media plays in our communities in continuously showcasing negative stereotypes of blackfellas. Any conversation about reconciliation or advancement or positive outcomes for our people must not blame us for where we are. And quite often the discussions are, that's where they start. Is that somehow we are the problem. We are not the problem. We know a little thing about survival and taking care of country because we've been doing it for a minute now. It's about time non-Indigenous people start to listen. People in authority, in places of authority and power, need to start shifting those conversations. How do we get more, how do we make truth-telling mandatory in primary schools? It shouldn't take someone to go through 12 years of, primary and secondary education only to then come to a university to find out that Cook didn't discover the continent. And then they go through university and then they finish and then we've got to deal with it. Folks, my name's Kevin Yao Ye. In terms of Reconciliation Week, I'd just like to make it very clear that I'm reconciled. I'm good. I know my mob. I know my bloodlines. I know my family tree. I think if we're going to be serious about Reconciliation Week, non-Indigenous people need to hold up a mirror to themselves and to the country that they once knew and ask some serious questions because it's starting to become a joke. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for those very strong words. And, we've already heard here this morning, action and truth-telling. So, many of the issues that you've raised, I hope people sort of listening today here in person or online can take some of what you've spoken about away and have those conversations. So thank you, Kevin. I'd also like to, while we're on the subject of QUT, give our thanks especially to Debbie Duthie, Carrie Melvin and Kate and everybody else here at QT for the work that they've done behind the scenes in making today run smoothly, and also to Sean, our IT person. Thank you. But right now I'm going to hand over to Judge Josephine Willis, who I introduced earlier. We're delighted that you're here to join us today. Judge Willis has been a judge of the Federal Circuit Court for 12 years, and before that was a barrister for 14 years at the private bar in Cairns, where I grew up, as a member of Trinity Chambers. She regularly travels to Townsville and Brisbane, sitting in on hundreds of matters each year. She's chaired 2 national committees examining judicial listing practices and case management, as well as the National Indigenous Access to Justice and Reconciliation Committee, addressing access to justice issues for First Nations litigants throughout Australia. The Federal Circuit Court entered into a Reconciliation Action Plan in 2014, being the first court in Australia's history to do so. Justice Willis is also a member of the Judicial Health and Wellbeing Committee. She was awarded a life membership of the North Queensland Women's Legal Service and has been recognised for her significant service to the judiciary in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in 2018. Please make welcome Judge Willis. I almost forgot to read your question. So Judge Willis, what do you see? We've heard this morning from different people on the panel, but what do you see in your role in particular as some of the major issues that are facing us today in terms of reconciling relationships with First Nations peoples? And what role specifically can the courts play as an agency in promoting reconciliation, particularly in terms of some of these structural issues? And why do you think it's so important for non-Indigenous people also to support reconciliation?
Thank you, everyone. It's an honour to be invited to be on this very distinguished panel today. I wish first to pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders on the land of this nation, and to the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I also wish to acknowledge the work of my friend Deborah Bennett and her working group here today, who have made all of this possible, and they've made all the phone calls and made us all feel very welcome. I've had the pleasure of knowing Deborah Bennett for some years now, and I think we're an example of reconciliation. We've worked together on several joint endeavours. I've listened and learned from Deborah about the true meaning of reconciliation, and we've got lots of things planned in the future. A couple of the things that we've done I'm going to talk about to you today. I must also acknowledge Auntie Rose. We've worked together for years. Again, I think we've done our reconciliation, and I'll tell you about something very exciting that we have pulled off very recently. In my court, the Federal Circuit Court, I have to say from the outset, it's a federal court, not a state court. We don't do crime, we don't do child protection, we don't do Aboriginal land rights. It's a court established primarily to deal with families and children. It's the court that most Australians go to. If you go to court, if you get divorced, if you want a property settlement, if you want arrangements made about your children, then you'll go to the Federal Circuit Court. And there's a whole lot of other things we do as well: bankruptcy, migration, trade practices. But for today's purposes, our work with families, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, is what I'm going to talk to you about. In our court, we have appointed Indigenous liaison officers. My number one thing as chair of the Indigenous National Access to Justice Committee for the last 12 years is that we need Indigenous liaison officers. And it's tired, you will be tired to hear that often we just, the court budget is always given as the reason why we don't have more of everything we need. I'm very pleased to say that in the last budget, the Federal Circuit Court got more funding than they've had before, and so another 4 Indigenous liaison officers are going to be appointed. So we're very pleased with that. We have registries all around Australia, so we have judges on our committee, on my National Access to Justice Committee in Darwin, in South Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, Parramatta, where I am in Cairns. And one of our positive focuses under our, when we entered into the RAP, which we were very excited about, we worked with Reconciliation Australia. We were the first court in the country to enter into a reconciliation action plan. It took us ages to actually have the engagement and work out what a court could do. We were an entirely different entity. So there were some things we could do and things we couldn't. One of the things that we really wanted to incorporate in our RAP was access to justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And so in our focus on doing that, some of the positive things have been, as a court, we've focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law students. I don't know if there's any law students, ATSI law students here today, but it occurred to us that we could help by inviting them in regularly to court events, by celebrating things like National Reconciliation Week with them, by inviting other judges, lawyers, Aboriginal legal services to come and meet the law students, because there's often a big gap between when you study law and then how do you actually get into law. And so we wanted to have introductions made, have them feel comfortable talking to judges and other lawyers. Various judges, as I have taken on mentoring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law students. And we've done that with great success. And I personally have been to the admission ceremonies of several lawyers and watched all of their families come. And what a proud day that is when you see the first solicitor from the Northern Peninsula area being appointed as a lawyer. In Cairns, we have got some wonderful Indigenous lawyers, Thelma Schwartz, Peter Parsons, Danella Mills, Narita Davis, to mention a few. We've also more recently got Malia Ben, who's a young female barrister who grew up in Yarrabah, and she's now reported back to me at the last time that we met that she'd been into court. She was as a young Aboriginal barrister. She was instructed by an Aboriginal solicitor. They were acting for an Aboriginal family in the children's court. So does access to justice get any better than that? To have, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being represented by people who utterly understand and know. So that's what we're trying to promote. One of the things our court did in trying to make our court more accessible was it actually changed its name. So again, we were the first court that ever changed its name in 2013. We used to be the Federal Magistrates Court. All of the judges on my national committee, we did personal engagement with a multitude of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander entities all around Australia. And we worked out that having the word magistrate in the court's name was really off-putting, that history goes back a long way, that magistrates was associated with police court, all sorts of connotations, bad connotations. So our name was changed to the Federal Circuit Court in acknowledgement of that, and hopefully to have more people coming our way. And one of the other big things that we did when we entered into a RAP was that we said, we realised that there are a lot of kin carers in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. This is a family arrangement. As you know, kin carers get the children, but they have no legal standing when it comes to things like trying to enrol them in school, authorised medical operations, get passports. And so together with Deborah Bennett and the people that she works with, we've run conferences trying to get the word out to grandparents that they can come to our court and get orders and get some legal standing. One of the exciting things that we have done, or that I personally have done this year, is to work with Auntie Rose on the new legislation that was introduced, Meraba Omaska Kaziwa Kazapa. It's the Torres Strait Islander traditional child rearing practice. And for the first time, there was about 30 years of lobbying for people to have that practice where, as a gift of love, a child is given to another family member or person, and to have that person get some legal standing. Again, so they can do all the things that parents do. And so those children have got all the normal rights. I worked with on drafting with the Working Party, and then representing the Working Party with Alastair Nicholson and so forth, getting that through. And it was the first piece of legislation in Queensland to be made in language other than English. So that was a super exciting day. As to the future, I say, Mother Teresa said, we cannot all do great things. We can only do small things with great love. In my view, everything starts with proper engagement, actually having nice small functions, getting to know people, listening, and that way you can make some progress. Thank you very much. It's been an honour to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Willis, and thank you for those inspirational words and examples that you've given. Our next speaker is Commissioner Scott McDougall, Queensland Human Rights Commissioner. Scott commenced in his current role in October 2018. Prior to his appointment, he was the Director and Principal Solicitor at Caxton Legal Centre in Brisbane. Since admission to practice in 1993, he has worked with and advocated on behalf of diverse marginalised communities. He's conducted major litigation and led program and policy development in a number of areas, including discrimination, native title, criminal law, guardianship, and coronial inquiries. Would you please welcome Commissioner McDougall? Commissioner Dougal, your question. We've been listening to others speak today about the importance of reconciliation. Firstly, how do you think the process of reconciliation has impacted awareness about the actual rights of First Nations people and the importance of anti-discrimination laws and policies? And secondly, how can we work together, again, in real and practical ways, as a community, as a state, to promote reconciliation and tackle some of these challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Toni. And I'll answer that question in a roundabout way. If you don't think I've answered it properly, I'm happy to take another direct question at the end. Could I start by acknowledging the traditional owners as well and this incredible panel of speakers that we have here today. It's a great honour to be here. It's an even bigger honour for me to be claimed as albeit a fringe member of the Morton family. So I have a long association with the Morton family going back many years to Strait Island. I'm very, very proud to be claimed. Today I did a talk this morning with Chair Eggert, actually, from Strait Island at another QUT event. And we talked about reconciliation. And I remember when I first started getting involved in Indigenous justice issues back in the late 80s, the idea that you would have mainstream corporations now signing up to things called stretch wraps, which would have been a bizarre concept even today by the sound of it, a stretch wrap. But for them to be engaged in trying to achieve things at a practical level, I think is fantastic, and it's testament to the work that Reconciliation and Karen and others have done over 20 years. And no doubt there's been lots of things achieved in that 20 years. But I think, as Kevin really eloquently stated and passionately and powerfully stated before, I really think it's time we started moving on after 20 years of having cups of tea and sessions, and albeit a lot of other important work. I think we now, as a nation, need to take the next step. So I think there's another R word that we should actually be embarking upon and embracing. And that R word is not recognition, which, although I think it would necessarily have to be part of the process, constitutional recognition. But the R word that I have in mind, and I know that I'm not inventing this, a lot of other people have said it already, is reckoning. I think Australia is long overdue the day of reckoning. So one of the great things about the modern world is you can just, as my little daughter tells me all the time, just search that up, Dad. So I searched up Day of Reckoning, and this is what it says. The time when one is called to account for one's actions, to pay one's debts, or to fulfill one's promises or obligations. I think it's a really neat way of summing up what Australia requires at the moment. So if we take those three elements one by one, call to account for one's actions. So the Statement of the Heart has called for the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If there's anyone is in any doubt as to why we need in this room at least, as to why we need one, can I ask the room whether anyone has ever heard of David Thompson Seymour? No one? What if I told you that David Thompson Seymour was Queensland's first ever police commissioner? He was appointed in 1863. He remained in that position for 31 years. 1894 was when he retired. 1894 was just when the Protection Acts came in. Prior to the Protection Acts, there was a regulation which actually not just imposed or authorised the use, but it actually imposed a duty on police officers to use lethal force to disperse any assemblage of blacks. That was the law, and that was the operation that was in place in Queensland for that 31-year period. In the course of that 31-year period, some academics have estimated that as many Aboriginal men, women and children were killed by police as Australian soldiers were lost in the First World War. These are facts, historical facts, that need to be out in the open. Nobody knew this. I worked for years in native title, thought I knew a lot, and then one day I encountered a book called Conspiracy of Silence. That made me go and do some more research. When you do the research, you go to some very dark places, but they're the sort of places that Australia needs to go to. So that's the first element. The second element is to pay one's debts. It seems like a long time ago now, but it's 2019 at the end of the year, the Woodford Festival I was at, and I happened to go along to a session where Noel Pearson was talking, and he reminded the audience about the deal that was struck with Paul Keating's government after the Mabo decision when the Native Title Act was introduced. So in order for existing landholders to get legal certainty about their title, the deal was done that native title holders would be able to claim compensation for all of the extinguishment of native title that occurred after the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975. It's now 30 years since, well, coming up to 30 years since the Native Title Act was introduced and that deal was struck. There's still, all that compensation is still outstanding. A couple of years ago, there was a decision by the High Court in Timber Creek, which provided a way for calculating that compensation. Some lawyers have estimated that the bill across Australia is $56 billion. Some Aboriginal groups have challenged that and said it's much more likely in the hundreds of billions of dollars. A couple of years ago, those sort of figures just would have seemed completely outside of the reach of, the mind of Treasury officials. But I have to say now, in the post-COVID world, where we tolerate shutdowns of entire capital cities, so this week's closure of Melbourne has apparently cost about $800 million. So in the post-COVID world, 56 billion really doesn't seem like such a big stretch. The third element of the definition was to fulfill one's promises or obligations. And this is where I think we need to look at the relationship between the two parties. The Statement of the Heart made a plea for a voice to Parliament to be created. It is achingly obvious that that is what is required. We need a new arrangement in Australia where there is a genuine sharing of power. So far for decades, we've had talk about partnerships, but no real genuine transfer of power to Aboriginal communities. And this could not be made clearer than in the Closing the Gap process. So at the moment in Queensland, they're developing an implementation plan to achieve these targets, and the targets, I have to say, are really worthy and worthwhile, and it's great that the Coalition of the Peaks have been able to achieve those targets. But the plan to achieve them, I have to say, is a diabolical joke. The existing draft plan amounts to nothing more than a collation of all of the failed policies that have been put in place for the last 10 years. It just baffles me how anyone could think that by some miracle those targets are going to be achieved with the same set of failed policies. There's no structural arrangement in place to actually negotiate any significant structural change that would actually achieve those targets. So I just wanted to wrap up by saying that in the year 2000, when we watched Cathy Freeman win gold, I think everyone could see the burden that she carried for Australia and that burden was created by the unfinished business that Australia has. It looks really likely now that we are going to have the Olympics return to Australia in 2032. We really need to get this business done before then. We've got this fantastic opportunity to actually genuinely have a reckoning in Australia, and we need to take that opportunity. Thank you. I told you I wasn't going to answer the question.
I think you've more than answered it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Scott McDougall, for your words of wisdom and sharing that with us. Our final speaker today, last but not least, is CEO of Reconciliation Australia, Miss Karen Mundine. Karen is from the Bundjalung Nation of Northern New South Wales. She brings more than 20 years' experience leading community engagement, public advocacy, communications and social marketing to her role at Reconciliation Australia. Over the course of her career, she's been instrumental in some of Australia's watershed national events, including the Apology to the Stolen Generations, the Centenary of Federation commemorations, Corroboree 2000 and the 1997 Australian Reconciliation Convention. She serves on various boards, including the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre. Thank you for joining us too today, Karen. Karen, Reconciliation Australia plays a significant role in the promotion of ongoing awareness and education about reconciliation at the national level. Could you speak, please, about some of the examples of organisational reconciliation action plans, the RAPs, that are working and best practice approaches or champion models that are being rolled out across the nation? I have to say, Auntie Rose and I last night were in Townsville at the Premier Awards for Reconciliation Awards, and there is some amazing work being done out in the communities. But more importantly, can you also speak, it's already been raised today, about the greater awareness in terms of reconciliation leading to a formal agreement or treaty acknowledgement and acknowledging the rights of Indigenous First Nations peoples? Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And my apologies. I'm not going to stand up because I'm going to try and be brief, because I always think getting into the other questions are the more interesting part of a discussion. But first of all, thank you, Auntie Kerry, again. We had the pleasure of being together this morning, and thank you for your beautiful and warm and heartfelt welcome to country. And as I said this morning, I always try to walk softly on your country. To everybody, to all of the speakers here today, and all of them who I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with everything that has been said to date. It's almost like they've answered so much of the questions already for me. when we talk about treaty, when we talk about truth-telling, when we talk about agreement making, when we talk about a voice to Parliament, it's all part of the conversation of reconciliation. 4 years ago, we put out the first state of reconciliation in Australia, and it was a bit of a litmus test to look into how are we going on this journey of reconciliation? What is going on? And not surprisingly, we found there's been some good stuff that's happening. There's been a lot of okay stuff that's happening. And increasingly, when we look at things like kids in out-of-home care, when we look at incarceration rates, we're falling woefully behind the aspirations of what we want for reconciliation. One of the things that we became very clear to us 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, I think, when we were writing it, was we needed a better definition. What do we mean when we talk about reconciliation? Because pretty much anything and everything, when it's got to do with First Nations peoples, is reconciliation. And that's not quite true as far as I'm concerned. But when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about 5 dimensions. And we drew this from looking at reconciliation processes right across the world, so in other parts of the world, but also what had been happening in Australia over the previous 25 years of that formal process that came out of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And the 5 dimensions are institutional integrity, equality and equity, race relations, historical acceptance, and unity. And in short, it's this idea that if we're going to get to this idea of a reconciled country, if we're going to progress in our journey of reconciliation, we need to be making progress across all of those 5 things. They are all connected, they're interrelated. And if something is lagging behind, that's as far as that progress is. So we can surge ahead in terms of, say, jobs and growing business. But if we're not dealing with racism in this country, we're only ever going to get so far. If we're not talking about actually how the institutions and structures of this country are engaging with us and often ignoring us, denying our rights or jailing us, then we're only going to get so far. We're not going to have jobs for our people if our people are in the system negatively through incarceration or in at-home care. So it was a big conversation. It was trying to boil it down into something that was accessible to all sorts of people. And I guess that's our blueprint for how we're going, our blueprint for progress, but also the challenges that still remain. A lot's been said about the theme for this year, More Than a Word, Reconciliation Takes Action, and it is absolutely a rallying cry, a call to action, particularly for non-Indigenous Australians, to be part of this conversation, but more than that, to actually do something. What we've known, and particularly we run a barometer, so a reconciliation barometer, every 2 years, and it looks at attitudes and perceptions. And look, I have to say, every 2 years, I look at the figures and I think, nothing's changed much. And I know that from my own personal experience. But when we looked back over the last 6 years, what we saw in small pockets, but nonetheless important, is more Australians than ever before know and understand about the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in this country and the impacts of those histories. More people than ever believe in this idea of reconciliation. So our challenge then is, if that's the case, if more people are engaging than ever before, how are we not seeing those tangible community outcomes in communities, in country? So one of the things that when I became CEO, it was really important to me, was to say, if we're doing all this work and we can't feel it, if when I go home I can't feel it and see it in my communities, then we need to do more. And I think that is our challenge, and that is our cry to people. We need to do more. Now, there are 1,100 odd organisations that have reconciliation action plans. They range from those that are at the reflect stage, into innovate, stretch and elevate. We like to call it the RISE framework. We'd like to think that it rises people up. It rises our ambitions of what we want to see and how we're going to go about doing that. I think it's really important to say people, organisations, they get things wrong. Not everyone gets it right 100% of the time, but we want to make sure that there is a community and a process for people to figure it out. And it's so great to see the people in this room and those that are joining. I'm sure you are all part of helping organisations figure it out. Now, sometimes we have to call that out when they get it so wrong that you can't just kind of go, well, oopsie, that's not good enough. And I think we've got this, again, huge cohort that sits behind that. But what we want is to see those greater actions. We want to see it being felt in difference. I think that when we think about some of those actions, and look, I spend a lot of this week going to morning teas, breakfasts, afternoon teas. There's a lot of lemon myrtle cupcakes involved. But they are important moments to connect. Relationships are at the heart of reconciliation. We need to find ways to understand each other, to know each other. Because then when we have that basis, we can actually start those harder conversations. I know if I walk into a room, particularly a boardroom with a lot of, and let's be honest, older white men in suits, if I start banging on about racism and the failure of systems and structures, I will get a very polite thank you and be never asked back into the room. That's not to say I let them off the hook, but I've got to find those common grounds. I've got to find a way to make them want to do this, to see that actually there is a business imperative to doing this, that it's not just good enough to go, well, you know, they're only 3% of the population, so it'll be okay. It won't be okay, because we as a nation, as a whole nation, will be poorer for it. When I think about the organisations that are doing it well, it's those that are challenging themselves, that are having those hard conversations, that are owning up. I love the word reckoning. I've loved it for ages, and I think it absolutely is a right time for that. Whether it happens in a day, I'm not so sure about this. Change happens slowly. People's attitudes and perceptions take time to change, to turn around. But I feel like it is happening in small pockets. I see it when I come to events like this and throughout the week. When organisations challenge themselves, when they challenge their own histories, their own complicitness in building structures that unfairly and disproportionately negatively impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's power to me. When I see people and business people who sit down and actually not just politely listen to an elder or to a community, but actually are engaging, are asking those questions, who sit there and take the brunt of some auntie waggling that finger at them and telling them what's what, and then go away and think about actually, what do I take from that and what do I need to change because of that? That gives me hope for it. When I see renaming and dual naming of cities and towns right across this country to talk about the true history of that land, and that in itself is an act of truth-telling, to acknowledge the first peoples, the first custodians and traditional owners. That's truth-telling and that's reconciliation. And that's the thing that gives me hope, because to be honest, if I didn't have those moments, I probably wouldn't get out of bed in the morning and I couldn't do the job that I do.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your words and those very strong sentiment there in terms of the passion that you bring to your role as CEO of Reconciliation Australia. I'd actually ask everybody, please would you give a round of applause for the entire panel today, who I'm sure you'll agree have been outstanding, and we are so very, very honoured and privileged to have the calibre of people here speaking, and what a privilege it has been even just to be here live in the room with all these giants. It's great. We have actually got some time now on the webinar, live and in person, for a Q&A session, and I am going to pass the mic to the panel, and you can submit your questions online to any member of the panel, to the panel directly, or through me, whichever way is easier. So if you'd like to submit them in the chat box now, feel free to do so, or if anybody would like to hand them up, we're certainly open to take them. Those questions, please. In the event that we can't respond to all of the questions, you can actually, you can actually contact either BATSIPA, the Brisbane Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Professional Association, by email if you need to. So I'm going to hand it over. Is there anyone? Do we have any questions here from people, live people in the audience? just have to COVID the mic.
Thank you, Toni. Thank you for this excellent conversation that we're having today. I really want to thank all of you who've joined us on the panel and everyone who's in the room, whether it's online or physically here at the QUT campus. I'd like to pose this question first to you, Scott, if you wouldn't mind. In your speaking about the reckoning and naming those various stages or milestones that you've seen that have or have not happened yet, I'd just like to put this question to you in, and it isn't necessarily linked directly to your line of work at the moment, but it's a more broader question. What do you think would change the way that policing is done in this country and in particular in Queensland at this time that might make a difference to the way, to the relationship that First Nations peoples have with the police and the judiciary? Thank you.
How's that? Technology, hey? So that is a really good question. Policing is a huge issue. And I mean, going back to that history that I was talking about, that very grim history, I just don't think that you can look at the relationship between police, Queensland police and Indigenous communities without taking into account that history. Many years ago, actually, I was up, when I was a law student, I went up to and worked with the Ingenuity Community Council on the tip of Cape York. And there was a lot of tension at that time between the community and the local police officers. And there was a lot of tension around land rights. This is pre-Mabo. And I remember there was an archaeologist who worked with the Ingenuity Council to actually go and get these police officers to come down to the Ingenuity Community Hall and do a role reversal play. And it was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever witnessed. Just seeing some of the local men pretend to be these white police, you know, throwing their power around, and then seeing the police have to sit there and watch that. But it really did work. And you talk about, you know, reconciliation. That was a fantastic example, and it, for a period at least, it did, you know, calm things down in that tension. I think when you look at the stuff that's going on with youth justice at the moment, we've taken a really backward step recently with the youth justice reforms. Really backward step. We need to be going in the complete opposite direction. I had a hookup just last week with the Children's Court judge from New Zealand. New Zealand has a completely different approach to youth justice, and it's something that Australia really needs to pick up on. So before a child is charged in New Zealand, the police, unless it's a very serious offence or community safety is at risk, the police cannot charge a child without first having a conference with the family of the child, and then all of the services, the wraparound services that are available, and they actually have services that are available to those children and those families. So they have to go through that process, and only if, as a result of that conference, it's determined that there is no alternative than to charge the child, then the child gets charged. So that is the sort of thing we need to be moving toward. Educating the police force about the history. I'm certain that the majority of Queensland police would have no idea about what actually happened in that period that I'm talking about, and how that might impact on the trust that exists or doesn't exist between communities and police.
Just further to that, thank you, Scott. Let's be very clear about this. We make up I think they're saying 3.3% of the population now. What we know for sure is that a large group of our population is birth to 25. When you think about in this place, this state, Queensland, which is a particularly violent state on First Nations people. The new youth justice reform and legislation disproportionately targets and impacts First Nations people. Make no mistake of that. When we talk about evidence-based, everyone's talking about evidence-based, but then when it comes to policy and legislation, people like to just, oh, there's the evidence, let's go this way though. What we know for sure is that, tracking monitors, and that is one of the major changes for the new youth justice reform, is that these things don't work and they don't deter young people away from the criminal justice system. And in fact, it further demonises our most vulnerable in society, which, folks, let's make it very clear, is mostly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. In recent years, I've seen no further youth justice, I've seen no new youth shelters for young people, but then you go out to Youth Detention Centre and they've got a new building. So build a new building for the detention centre, but never mind that any youth shelters. What we know for sure is that there's young people sitting out there right now at the Youth Detention Centre who don't have bail addresses, and that is why they are remanded in custody. The changes also include the onus is now on the young person to prove why they should get bail. This stuff disproportionately impacts us and targets us. So let's be very clear about that. Thank you, Deb.
Hi, this is just for pretty much the panel. My name's Lorraine. I'm not representing where I work. This is a personal question. I need to be very clear of that. So, and just one statement, I guess, just to go back to what Commissioner Scott had spoken about. Youth justice actually has restorative justice, a component of that in its system. The trouble with it is that the child has to plead guilty to be able to get into that system. I worked in youth justice forever and a day, many years ago, and that was one of our biggest issues, was actually having that child commit that they'd actually committed a crime when they're 10 or they're 12 or they're 13 or whatever. And yes, I'm not saying they didn't commit a crime, but what I'm saying is that restorative justice it was just plucked to pieces and brought over and just dumped. And it had always been a struggle with that, always. The other thing is interesting about the police situation, my youngest son had actually obtained his confirmation of Aboriginality, as we do for particular jobs and blah blah and all the rest of it. And he said to me, he said, "Mum, guess what?" He said, "I got my confirmation." And I said, "Yeah, cool, that's great." And he goes, "Well, now I get the right to get picked up, abused, and, sent to jail because that's actually my ticket in." He's 30 this year and he got that when he was 25, but that's how he actually seen it. He knew he had to get it, but that's how he actually seen it. Was, to be proven that he was Aboriginal, fair-skinned, not a big deal. I mean, it doesn't matter about the colour of our skin. It's how people see in colour, or they see human beings, or they see black or whatever. So that was a really interesting thing. It's always stuck with me, is that's what he's come up against. So I disagree with the Aboriginality form only because I've been born and bred on country and all the rest of it, but I understand why it's needed. I do, don't get me wrong. I put a challenge to the whole of the Reconciliation Committee, as well as to Karen, and really, really love your work, is that I would actually like to see on all of our big non-government boards and NGO boards and all of those non-Indigenous organisations that we have, is to have Aboriginal doctors and lawyers and social workers and, just everyday people that just know what they're doing and understand the system, because the one thing that we do know is the system. Unfortunately, we know it inside out and we work it. You know, we work it to our own advantage when we need to. We're survivors. We do what we need to do. So, but thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Is there anyone on the panel that would like to? Karen, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. One of the areas that we're really focused on, particularly with RAPs and particularly with organisations that have been working in this space, and I do the bunny ear invisible quotes, is that's great when you have your little program over here, but the real power sits in the leadership, and it sits in the boardroom, and it sits in the C-suite. So increasingly, I think people are surprised when I say, when Telstra messed up and I said, no, I'm sending a note, a letter, an email to the CEO. And they're like, oh, no, talk to the Aboriginal program manager. And it's like, no, I'm the CEO of Reconciliation Australia. I'm talking to the CEO, and he needs to know that they need to be held to account. And to their credit, within 24 hours, I got a phone call and we had a meeting. We've worked through all of that. And likewise with Woolworths, with the things happening. That is where we need to make the change, because that's where it follows. And we know that successful RAPs, the ones that are doing it well, is when leadership is involved. And they're making sure that as it flows down through the organisation, it is being committed to at every single level. Because it can't just happen just at the bottom, where people are often powerless within organisations, best intentions, but the system fails them. Leaders make decisions that change systems. And I just wish that some of our political leaders, and apologies to anyone here who is representing government, because there are some great things that do happen, but political leaders need to catch up with the rest of society.
Thank you, Karen. There's a question up the back. Just bring up a microphone. Can people online hear questions through the microphone? Do they need repeating? You should be okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, panel. That was a really wonderful discussion that you guys were doing there before. When you Google QPS and reconciliation, when you Google QPS and reconciliation action plans, nothing comes up. They've got a pathetic cultural capability action plan that runs out this year. When all these conversations of reconciliation, how often are the QPS part of that conversation, or an initiative from them to have that conversation or start to implement a reconciliation action plan for the whole QPS, because they seem to be still operating on turn-of-the-century frameworks?
That's one for me. Look, I think it's a really good point. We have a policy that we don't like mandating reconciliation action plans. I think, and our experience, particularly in the early days, when the federal government said, oh, we're not really going to support you anymore, but we'll make it mandatory for all federal government departments to have a RAP. So everybody did it because they had to do it, but I have to say they were pretty mediocre at best. Those organisations that actually saw what it was, which is, it's just a framework and a business plan to help an organisation to think about things in a more structural way. Those that got it and saw the benefit of it and continue to do it have gone on to do really good things. Everybody else, as soon as there was a change of government, it all fell over and went away. We know that we've got a hit list of organisations, organisations that we know directly impact the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people every single day, and they're not part of this program yet. And so we're out there, basically I'm trying to do a sell job on them to get them as part of the program, to get them to see there is benefit, that there is an opportunity here to be better and do better through this. It's a bit of a lot of sugar, a little bit of a stick, but it's something that we're continuing to work on. I know in other states' jurisdictions, we've just started those processes. WA is one of those ones, and they have an equally appalling history, I would say, there. It's still early days. I know a lot of mob over there are very frustrated when they say, oh, well, they've got a RAP and they're not doing this. They've literally been on this journey for 5 minutes, and there's 200 plus years that we have to unpack. But I think that's where truth-telling and historical acceptance. And when we talk about historical acceptance, it's not just about knowing dates and events of things that happened in the past, but it's actually accepting that those things that happened and the way that they were felt and experienced continue to have an impact on the relationships and how we think about each other and trust that we do and don't have, how that plays out today and in the future. So I am impatient. I want it to be happening faster and quicker, but I can only get us working as fast as the slowest person in the room. So, and again, that's why I really appreciate everyone that plays a role within reconciliation, because everyone is part of that kind of pushing, prodding, smacking sometimes, although we're not allowed to do that anymore, but trying to push further. And we see some value, and again, that's where I say leadership comes into it. When the WA Police Commissioner says enough is enough, we have to do things differently, people listen. And we need more people like that, actually not just sort of saying, oh yeah, that's important, but being vocal about that, being upfront about it and dragging their colleagues with them.
Thank you, Karen. I might hand the microphone down the other end to Auntie Rose and to Judge Willis. There's a couple of questions here that have come through the chat box. This one is, and I know Auntie Rose, both yourself and Judge Willis working in the workplace a lot with reconciliation. Question is, what advice do you have for someone who is the only Indigenous person in a workplace that has some work to do in reconciliation?
Repeat that again, please.
What advice do you have for someone who is the only Indigenous person in a workplace that has some work to do in reconciliation?
Well, I think I always think in a way broadly, because one person cannot just do the job itself, because there's a whole lot of us in that, in a different structure, different tribal groups, different areas, so, or even inclined to awareness of being a culture, knowing the culture, the protocols, what we have. And I think it's always, I would always like to, when there's just not one person, but advisors along, with the relevant people that can give input into that plan, to be able to work collectively, because, sometimes our people are like that, well, we make that job himself, yeah. So he didn't consult with us. And I think one of the things that I would, there was something else before you asked that question is that because I'm a language speaking person, I always have a problem in English language, in a way of like, because we think like us, all of us, isn't it? That's the truth. Because if you're a Torres Strait Islander Aboriginal person, you think first and foremost, the question, it doesn't matter you speak in English, but you think as an Indigenous person. So there's a problem with that. So when you start putting things into other terminology, it changes the flavor of that. It changes the meaning of it. I always have a question about that, in a way, how we then, because if we're sitting there, there's people in the room that would know that, how we trying to say, oh, well, how best we're going to address this now, because we're speaking in English, so we're going to write it down in English, but you're missing blackful away. And to give them the real understanding of writing it down, we're going to work harder on that, to be able to have that kind of link in a way. Like I would love to interpret it, because I'm a linguistic. Anything that Deb always asks me to do things like that. In the language, I could interpret it the way how we think and how this action plan would go about. And now we want to bring our other non-Indigenous brothers and sisters into this space to be able to have that better understanding of our people. So I think in a way to answer your questions, I think that collectively, one person cannot do that. We always have that group of ours that can have an input to make it more in depth and more understanding, to have those knowledges. One person cannot just deliver that. I'm talking of Torres Strait Islander people because we are from the tribal, different clan groups from Maori to Boigu. So we cannot talk to Eastern Island. I can only talk to Top Western Island. I will have an input on the Top Western Islands. I would have an input on NPA. But in a way of doing that, we all come together and say, okay, we're going to work through this one like this, so we can all understand one another.
Thanks very much, Auntie Rose. I'm just aware of our time. There's another question that has come through, I think, that Judge Willis touched on earlier. I might address this to you, Judge Willis. This question asks, when it comes to encouraging young First Australians to work in spaces like family law, child protection, youth justice, how do you get them in there without them being pushed into identified or token roles? I know you spoke about Indigenous liaison roles. So again, this has come through the chat box, but I'm imagining this question's about people feeling that they're not getting into those roles unless they are in an identified role, if that makes sense.
It's tricky. I have to say, with all the young lawyers that I've met as law students, they're incredibly committed. I always feel like they carry a burden that they're going to do it for everyone. And I've often tried to say to them, you do it, you know, first do it for you and be the best you can. And then you work out where you'd like to work and what you'd like to do. And there's a whole lot of ways that you can have influence. I think sometimes they're just overwhelmed by what's ahead of them and how can they live up to everybody's expectations. But sticking with it, and I haven't seen any lawyers in token roles. And in family law, we've got Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Legal Service, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service, legal aid, and they're really serious matters. And all day, every day, we're seeing families that are overwhelmed with violence, you know, alcohol abuse, mental health, drug addiction. And most of the young lawyers I see are itching to be the ones standing up representing one or other of those parties. Or as I sometimes say to people, to the mother and father, if what you say about each other is true, your child will surely end up in foster care. Go away and come back with the grandmother, come back with your aunt, come back with someone. And if they come back with someone that, you know, is fine and upstanding, and doesn't matter if they don't have a blue card, we don't look at that. You might have done things when you were young, that doesn't matter. But I think most of them want to be there doing it. The Indigenous liaison officer roles are incredibly important, certainly in court, because everyone's frightened of court, particularly we think Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal litigants because of all the history and everything else. So I think some institutions do probably, you know, if you feel that you're having lip service paid, I'd leave if it was me, because there's so many places that are wanting good liaison officers to make a huge difference. Then it's a bit like if you don't like reading, you haven't found the right book. If you're not making an impact and you're not feeling that they're valuing what you've got, then go somewhere where they are, you know, because they're incredibly important roles. Judges, all sorts of people know that. We can do all sorts of things with someone that's very experienced. I've worked with Josephine AM, you know, we could say, go and talk to the families or bring them in, or, you know, we could just do things with already someone experienced and Indigenous that's comfortable in the court, that can explain things to them and they know the processes that we can't do without. So you've just got to make sure you know, I'd say that to anyone, if you're in a solicitor or anywhere and you don't feel like you're being valued, leave. Take your valuable commitment somewhere else.
Just quickly before we wrap up, one Indigenous person, one black fella in a workplace sounds like an OH&S issue. Managing whiteness is hard work. Before we wrap things up, I think it's really indicative, you know, Karen spoke about when she is speaking to older white males, mostly in corporate Australia, that she has to appeal to their financial gains that might help their business. Whereas black fellas, and Karen, I know you agree that for us, we're out here marching the streets for our lives. We're not appealing to anyone's financial gain. I'd like to also mention, you can keep your cupcakes and we want our land back. And we want treaties and we want reparations, if we're going to be real.
couldn't agree anymore. Yeah. But I think also just talking about when you're the only black fella in a room, and absolutely in terms of that having to deal with whiteness, but I guess it's also about looking for those allies, and increasingly I'm talking about our accomplices, the other Australians who are wanting to help and support, who are on their own journeys, and you don't have to be their spirit guide in that, but they can be also your allies and your strength to help you help figure out some of those other systems and how you work that system. And as you were saying before, we are good at working the system because we're still here and we continue to be here and we continue to assert ourselves and our sovereignty within these processes and systems.
Thank you very much. I just know you might need a microphone just to be brought up. Oh, it's on the webinar. Yes. We've just got one last question there.
This is kind of a comment, but also it's a question. And I think each of us need to go away and think about it. And for those who work with me and we support each other and debrief each other and mentor each other and all the jazz, when we've had enough, you know, so that we can then go back in and start again. The couple of things I've written down, and I really thank you, Scott, for mentioning that book. Is it Conspiracy of Silence? Yeah, that one, because that really is it really explains the past and the depth of what happened for our people everywhere. And I do tell people, anywhere there's a town, there's a city, there's a camp, there's a estate, blood was shed there to get it all around this continent. But the thing I'm just talking about is, you know, we talk about that term unconscious bias or conscious. I think there's a conscious, unconscious bias, right? And the conspiracy of silence is still here because, like was just said, it's a no-go zone unless there's the dollar signs looking attractive and the leadership will look at it or, you know, be a bit softened up towards it, let's say. But in terms of the relationships of power and sharing power, it's a real concern for me because I've done a few RAPs and also auditing organisations for their business plans and cultural frameworks, etc., etc. Workplaces servicing 10, 20, 40%, where that 40% Indigenous clientele or 50%, they really should be having the same amount of staff. So why hasn't that happened yet? That's a, you know, that to me, I go to places and I see it and I say, well, what's your client base, Indigenous client base? Oh, okay, so how many Aboriginal people work here? Oh, okay. So you're servicing 28%, but you've got 3 Indigenous, right? So to me, the system of power is totally in place. And, you know, Judge Willis, you know, what you were saying about young people feeling pressured to go this way or that way. We have a kinship structure and a culture. And so part of that, we all have a responsibility and a place in that. And we place people in that. And why I said that about Mr. McDougall, Scott, is that, you know, he is a father of some of my grandies, couple, you know, cousins, grannies, but also that's how we see each other. And so a place has been made for him because that family unit is very important. And so it doesn't matter if it's going out a few circles, there is still a place. And I know that when you see Mom, we're happy to see him and yarn with him. So I think that that's something that and the other thing, and I know Stephen has done a lot of work on this, Mr. Hagan there, the thing about language and our Aboriginal people, our First Peoples, our First Nations. Well, I didn't think I was owned by any non-Indigenous people, but See, that's still that mentality and psychology of the Flora Fauna Act. Our First Nations, I do not say our non-Indigenous people. I say non-Indigenous people, unless we're very close and I say, oh, come here, my Duggai sister, brother. But I wouldn't do it. So while we're still using language that is putting us back in as flora and fauna and objects belonging to, well, I don't know where we're belonging, but I think they're the things that when measuring how the power is handed over and how cultural constructs are created that are abiding by our ways, so that you're not having that poor one person, and I've worked in that too, you know, but if you've got 3 clan groups or 6 tribes, you've got to have representatives from each of them there. And we can help develop with those workers a framework that keeps them social, emotional wellbeing healthy. So that's some of my comments and etc.
Thank you so much, Janke, for those comments. Look, unfortunately, we're going to have to wind it up for people online because it's just on 2 o'clock. This conversation, as I'm sure you'll all agree, could go on for another couple of hours. It's so interesting. And just from the questions that have come through the chat and here in person, and all the food for thought that's been given by the panel members alone has been tremendous. And I want to thank you all for being here and participating today. So would you please just give all the panel members another round of applause? Thank you, everyone. And thank you all for joining us online. If you have to leave now, we understand. We'll do our thank yous in person, offline. Thank you.